they're attaching this spiritual significance to politics. Politics is a kind of theology. It is really one of the only theologies we have left. There's so much confusion that even I stumble over in my own thinking about, do we live in a secular society or do we live in a deeply religious society? There is this constant, again, there's this inversion, there's this confusion about, we think of ourselves as a secular society, but we are actually, in fact, quite religious. Give the example of the Black Plague. When the Black Plague hit many parts of Europe, there were many different responses. Sometimes there was a religious response. Sometimes people would literally wall off a village or town and not allow people to come in. There were many different responses, localized responses. It wasn't just some centralized top-down authority telling everybody what to do. But everyone sort of responded in their own way, in their own regions, and some regions were hit hard and others were not for various different reasons. With the refugee crisis, there really is no localized response. I think there were some symbolic. I remember there were some German towns that were building fencing around the town or something. I don't think that had any standing in terms of actual policy. I think it was merely symbolic. But you have this psychological effect where people are coming in, and the welfare state is not about, a tax collector going to your door and knocking on your door and saying, hey, where's your money? Give me your money. It is a technical, financial, digital transaction where, not even through taxation necessarily, but through inflation as a tax, through all kinds of mechanization. You have labor, you have work, you have creativity, whatever. You have the economy in general, which somehow in some way there is some siphoning from this modern monetary theory economy, this ambiguous, amorphous, quantitative easing economy. No one quite knows what it is. It's based on who knows what. It's kind of a mystical experience. The economy is kind of a smoke and mirrors mystical thing. That's not to say it's due to collapse, but it's saying almost that the economy is dependent upon spiritual power. The economy is dependent upon psychological power. It's dependent upon sociological power. It's not like the libertarians, we're going to run out of gold. And, eventually the economy is going to collapse. No, the economy will live so long as the religion of capitalism and the economy will live. So long as that religion lives on, the economy will live on, because it's sustained by the faith of the believers, of the masses of millions who believe in capitalism. Whoa, Freudian slip there. But it is a religious thing. And I haven't got through the Chris Bond and all of the interviews he's done. I plan to do that at some point. But, he's making this very interesting point about currency itself has a centralizing effect. That even something like cryptocurrency has a centralizing effect. It gives central powers greater power. And this is kind of blowing my mind. And this is really key. This is really interesting. But the idea of monetary theory and economic theory as like a deep spiritual esoteric thing, understanding economics, like the Freudianism of it, Keynes talking about the bear and the bull, and it's almost like these Jungian archetypes and the mass psychological element of it. And there's something to this. As a autistic, straightforward, superficial libertarian who only sees the surface level, you're going to say, oh, well, if it's smoke and mirrors, then it's doomed to fail and it's going to collapse, and we need like bars of gold that we can touch and taste and sniff and rub all over our bodies in order for the economy to be on a rock-solid foundation. Think about even the metaphors that we're using, as opposed to this miasma that descends upon the crowd and, it raises the stocks and lowers the stocks. And it's very much like a magic spell. So, there's levels to this. There's different perspectives on this. But essentially, the economy, Homo economicus, we have changed psychologically. And so the response to, a million people just moved into your country, and they might not have jobs, but they're going to, it's gonna be fine. We can do that because of technology. This would not have worked out the same way in the olden days. The response to it, the whole movement, this would not have worked out the same. This is a little bit different. This is a little bit strange. This is a little bit weird. I mean, we know that when Europe was a more bigoted place in terms of religion, that having a bunch of people from Muslim countries move in, might not have been taken to so kindly. They might have done, the Spaniards might have gotten upset about that. So things have changed for the better. People are more open-minded. All of this is due to technology, right? Everything, there's a lot of good stuff going on. You have to understand that money is spent on different things, not as a function of we only have these many gold bricks and we have to budget things exactly so that we only spend as much as we earn. That may be how you have to budget your own life, unless you want to take out a bunch of credit card loans or something. It's more disastrous for an individual. For a nation, for a country, this is the times we're living in. And I kind of explained this before in terms of the dollar will have worth and value so long as America has power projection. The moment America stops having power projection, the dollar is going to flunk. It's going to fail. It's going to plummet. It doesn't matter what else you do. It doesn't matter if we sell off all our debt. It doesn't matter if we back our dollars with gold. None of that really matters at the end of the day. None of that's going to solve the issue. The issue is the USD, greenback, is dependent upon American power projection. As long as we have power projection, everyone everywhere around the world is going to buy our greenbacks and accept them as good currency and just say, okay, no matter how much we print, no matter how much inflation we have, no matter what the debt is, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. As long as we have power projection, we can force foreign governments to accept greenbacks for a given rate. Now that is somewhat adjusted to Federal Reserve and state banks or national banks or whatever, Federal Reserve banks, whatever you want to call them. So there's like this intermediary pseudo-private, pseudo-public thing that's not elected by people, but it's also not like a profiteering thing. It's weird. People get into all kinds of crazy theories about it. But it's just a simple thing. It's just there's a layering aspect. There is the outcome that you want, the foundational thing that you need in order to make that thing happen, and then there's the kind of messy in between. So, we want to project our power. The way that we do that is through media and military and religious movements, ideological movements, politics. And there's all this kind of in between. It's like, oh, well, we're going to give some foreign aid here. We're going to do an arms deal there. We're going to have an NGO here. So there's multiple levels where there's private aspects, public-private. Is Facebook a public company? Is Google a public utility? Is Microsoft, Yahoo? Are these state-owned operations? Do we live in communism? Or do we live in capitalism? Well, it's confusing. It's topsy-turvy. It's hard to tell. It's incestuous, right? You can't make heads or tails of it. You look at the front, you look at the back, and you're like, where does this thing? It's like an economic centipede. You don't know what's going on. But ultimately, there are certain incentives that go in. There's a certain input-output mechanism. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine. You input some kind of incentive, lobbying money, whatever. You input something. There is a process. It's weird. It's hard to understand. It's hard to unfold. Frankly, kind of a waste of time to even try to get into that. Maybe you do it a couple times, for example, just to understand. Oh, okay, I see how that's possible. I get it. I understand. But to do that analysis every single time is kind of pedantic. But there's an input. There's some kind of incentive that's put into the system. The system processes it in a number of ways, public, private, in between, all of the rest. And then there's an output. And then there's an action. Then there's a consequence. That's kind of how it works. So again, I just think people have to look at the big picture. When I hear people focusing in on this $1 billion, this $1 billion, that, well, we could have taken that $1 billion, we could have taken the $1 trillion on the Iraq War and built this many houses and bought this many lollipops, and the back and forth, it's like things happen because there's an incentive for it to happen. There is not an incentive to give free stuff to everybody infinitely. That's not an incentive. The incentive is to keep people in a game. And a game requires challenge. So we can't just give everyone free stuff forever. And if we did give everyone free stuff forever, I mean, that would that kind of system, you have to do it kind of incrementally, right? You have to do it in a way that makes sense. I think there are, at some point, maybe you do hit some kind of hard limit. I mean, if you gave, I think you could. I think Bernie Sanders is right. I think, you know what? I think some of the economic leftist people, I think they're right. I think you probably could afford, I think the United States government, if it wanted to, it could make sure that every single person had a house, every single person had a job, a guaranteed job. You go to the government, you say, I want a job. They say, okay, show up here tomorrow and your training begins and we're going to start paying you. Paid training. You know, you could get food on everybody's table. No one goes hungry. We almost have that already. We have homeless shelters. We have soup kitchens. We have government-sponsored job programs. We have a lot of that already. It's just not 100% guaranteed as it was in East Germany or the Soviet Union. So, you know, there's a distinction there, maybe a moral distinction. But I think the government pretty much does afford to do this already. You know, how far can you push that? How far can you push that with something like UBI? How far can you push that until... The question for me is not even when do we run out of money. That's not the question. The question for me is when do people sort of wake up and say, oh, this is all fake. And this is funny money. And we don't actually have to work to get stuff. You know, because we can just borrow from the future. Or we can just imperialize other countries. We can force them to buy our greenbacks and profit off the sweatshop labor of third world countries, you know, where they actually do work, you know. Or we can just sit around and let robots do most of it. Robots are going to replace the sweatshop workers, right? They're going to replace humanity. So there are all these trends and currents that are going on that could lead to instability. So when we talk about UBI, when we talk about giving people free stuff, I think the reason why it doesn't happen isn't because it couldn't happen. I think the reason it doesn't happen is because when you look at the pros and cons from a social administrative standpoint, it's not worth it. Giving people all kinds of free stuff, I think, would reduce a kind of, not a confidence necessarily, but reduce a kind of fear and reduce a kind of insecurity. I think insecurity is a way you control people. If people feel like, oh, the economy is kind of like, it's kind of weird and it causes me worry and anxiety, you want a little bit of that, right? You want a little bit of people kind of feeling the pinch. You want people to be trapped in the rat race. You want people to be struggling and clawing and competitive, and you want a little bit of that. You also want to make sure people aren't starving, because if people are starving, they start to get violent. So there is a kind of a careful balance you have to strike, which is the position we find ourselves in. We're not a pure capitalist system. We're not a pure communist system. But we have a finely tuned system that democratically responds to society, that evolves over time. In some ways, you know, you can no longer afford a house on a single factory worker's income as you could back in the 1950s. So certainly the economy has gotten worse in that sense. In another sense, the amount of homeless shelters and soup kitchens and obesity, and a lot of that has, you know, is kind of an indication of like, wow, it's never been easier to be a lazy person in America than at any other point in American history. But you also look at, you know, a tribal society and certain feudal societies where maybe the case was that people were just helping each other out in those societies and were kind of going through cycles of competition, cycles of communism versus capitalism, sharing versus, you know, dog eat dog, libertarian world, you step on my lawn, you eat my shotgun, that kind of thing. So maybe we're going through cycles in history. But anyway, yeah, the economy, it's a weird thing. It's a weird thing. So when people, when you say, oh, you could just take the 3.8 and give it somewhere else, that's not really true. I mean, again, it's not like we have this much stuff and we can apportion it in this way. It's like we have we have whatever we say we have, okay? The federal government can spend whatever it votes to spend on. You know, that's it. That's the only thing stopping it. So again, it's not like, oh, we don't spend something on this, and so we can gain something in the other area. Um, I don't know. I don't know what it must be like. It's just weird to me. It's very strange. Maybe the entire facade is held together by libertarians. Maybe the Murray Rothbard and Mises Institute. Maybe Mises Institute is the one thing holding together the illusion that we have like limits to government spending. Because to my mind, we don't. We just don't have limits. There's no limits. The limit is we go to war with a country and we lose in a big way. Not in like a Vietnam sense, like a proxy war somewhere. Vietnam was just an experiment. It was a social experiment. It's kind of a prank, actually. Not to, of course, I feel bad for the Vietnamese people. I think they're really nice and I like their culture. But that's the attitude of the government about it. That was their attitude, is they were kind of like, they kind of had I mean, literally, they were filming the whole thing. Like, they were filming thousands of platoons all the time. And they were kind of like, hey, dude, look, there's a camera right over there. It's a social experiment. It was, in fact, a social experiment. So we didn't lose Vietnam. If we lost a war in a big way against like China or Russia, that's when you'd see the economy collapse. Barring that, there is no spending limit. So what we spend on, it's just like, it's like nobody knows how much money we have. I mean, do you know anybody like that? Do you know someone who's so rich they don't know what their credit limit is? They don't know. It's a weird, ambiguous place to be. But again, hating people, unfortunately, democratic politics does rely a lot on resentment. People's willingness to get engaged with politics, to alienate friends and family, to get in political arguments, really is based on hatred and resentment. People are not willing to fight over happy feelings. People are willing to fight over negative feelings. People are willing to fight over resentment. In the animal kingdom, you don't fight because sometimes there's these corny lines like, we don't fight for hatred. We fight for love. We love something, so we defend it. Now, you fight because you hate the people who are attacking the thing you love. You're not feeling love when you're fighting. In the animal kingdom, animals fight with aggression, anger. So when we want to get people politically involved, we have to make them resentful. We have to make them angry. We have to make them feel jealous. Like, oh, these people are getting something you're not, and you should be angry, and you should be upset, and you should go fight those people. Is that a wise move? I don't know. When you look at the whole picture here, and you're like, people just have money, and they use that money to make the government do things that they want it to do. If you don't like that, you're going to have to outspend them in one way or another, financially, ideologically, militarily, one way or another. You're going to have to outspend them. You're going to have to overpower them. People will do and listen to whoever is speaking at the present moment. That is how people act. If you're watching my video, you're listening to me. If you're not watching my video, you're watching someone else's video, you're listening to them. Again, I don't know how to emphasize this any more harshly. I think it's great to look at history. I think it's great, I think Germany is a great example of a country that was a monarchy, and then it was not a monarchy, it was a democracy, and then there were people who were threatening communism, and then eventually you had a right-wing government, and then eventually you had a split in the government, and then you had a capitalist economy and a communist economy. And then those both came together to be a social democratic country. You see all these political changes, and within each of those iterations you find true fanatics who believe, people who believed in the monarchy. And till their dying day they swore an allegiance to the king. And they were willing to fight and die for the king. You saw those people die in droves in World War I. What did they die for? They died for the Kaiser. And then it all disappeared, right? And then the Weimar Republic, you had the democracy, people willing to fight and die for democracy. People willing to fight and die for communism and for other causes as well. And then you had fanatics. And you had these fanatics, and they said, this is our country, and this is the way it's going to be, and this is our ideology, and we're going to fight and die for it. And then it disappeared. And then there was, again, it's like a social experiment. Half the country was communist, half the country was capitalist. Not in terms of population, not in terms of geography, but East Germany, right? A sliver of the country was communist. Part of the country was just deported and turned Polish. People don't talk about that. But, that happened as well. So there's all this stuff that people are willing to be subjected to. So long as they recognize that authority has told them to do something, they will do it. If authority says you're a monarchist, you're a monarchist. If authority says you're a social democrat, you're a social democrat. If authority says you're right-wing, you're right-wing. If authority says you are not right-wing anymore, you're actually a capitalist, okay. Well, what if authority says you're a communist? Well, we can see the way that people adapt and they conform. And then people say, oh, well, what about when communism was overthrown? Well, you really have to understand, and that probably deserves its own video. People talk about, I think it's Sutton, esoteric name drop. People talk about how the Soviet Union was not entirely organic in its formation. I've actually gotten in some debates with some kind of socialist people who said, no, actually the Soviet Union was kind of organic in its formation because you had a lot of disaffected Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians and Poles, people who are not ethnically Russian, who wanted to see the overturn of the Russian Empire and wanted to do something new. And so I'm sympathetic to that for a number of reasons, and so I think there's an element to that. But certainly the fall of the Soviet Union, when we ask how did that come about, was that random, was that spontaneous? Or do we know, like Operation Gladio, do we know that there were high-level psychological and cultural experiments being done to bring that about from a top-down level? How, for the people who were in Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, who was he? Who was that guy? Where did he come from? What was he about? Was he like a Winston Churchill? Boris Yeltsin, alcoholic. Winston Churchill, alcoholic. Both important guys. Both important guys that changed the direction of their country fundamentally. Both guys, maybe they were having financial problems randomly. Both guys come to power one way or another, and they change the direction of the country. Interesting figures to look into. But the idea that the Soviet Union collapsed under populist democracy is not true. In 1956, the Hungarians had a populist uprising. It failed. Populism always fails unless it is authorized by a dominant authority. Meaning that the Hungarian Revolution failed because there was only one dominant authority in Hungary, and that was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union said no. The Soviet Union collapsed because the United States was willing to insert itself in a number of ways, culturally, politically, certain actors, multi-layered approach, economically. It was willing to insert itself with a plan, and it was willing to do that in order to achieve objectives. And so there was an authority, a dominant authority, which authorized that action, which authorized that populism. And that populism, people, again, the nature of crowds, the logic, the science of crowds, the sociology of it, the psychology of it, is very much determined by people will form a crowd, they will form a riot when they feel authorized to do so. When someone gives the authority to do so. And we remember it either as a popular uprising and a liberation and an Independence Day. We remember it positively if it's been authorized. And we remember it negatively, or we just don't think about it at all. There have been so many riots in America over so many things that we don't remember, we've forgotten, we make no reference to. And at any time a protest happens, we think of it, oh, this is so incredible, this has never happened before, this is so transformative in our country. They've never cracked open a history book, or it's just not in the history book because no one cares. Right? So when we actually look at history, we see that power and its ability to authorize so-called populism, that populism only matters to the extent that it has some kind of higher authority behind it. When I say authorities, I'm talking about media, military, and money. Those are the authorities we're talking about. We're not talking about the peasants and the middle class and the bureaucracy and the officer class or anything like that. You fund an NGO that's like, we're going to build churches in South America. We're going to build a school in Africa. We're going to build this and build that. That's also a thing to look into the charities, because the United States is the most charitable country in the world. We give more
private donations than any other country. But all those private donations, it's not that you're flying on a plane and hand delivering people a Big Mac. That's always through an intermediary of an NGO. And 80%, I mean, statistics are really bad. 80% of these charities, the money is not going to where they say it's going. It's not buy a goat for an African village, buy a school building for, Uganda or something. 80% of it goes in a kind of a mysterious direction. So that's another thing we'd have to look at, is these private charities, these NGOs. Really an incredible amount of money that's being put into that. The whole system is very elaborate. It's intricate. It's complicated. It's impressive. I'm impressed. You should be as well. It's something to take the time to understand, at least understand the concept of it, the validity of it, the truth of it. Don't dismiss it. Don't say, well, the only thing we can do is just spend all of our time on the 2020 election. I'm spending time trying to debunk the notion of politics itself, because I don't think that's a good use of time, because I think time would be better spent elsewhere. So, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.